Hey everyone, doing something different today. I'm having a discussion with Jay, a guy that I met on Reddit. I had posted one of my latest videos, which was developing a submission system, how to choose a effective submission. And Jay watched the video and posted some really great stuff on Reddit. Basically, a debate countering some of my points, agreeing with some of my points here. And it's very rare to actually, I think, get a lot of good discussions on Reddit, especially ones that stay civil and don't resort to some name calling and certain fallacies in the arguments. And so we went on for a while, and I don't know about you, Jay, but I was I was enjoying it. It would take me 25 to 30 minutes to type some of that stuff out and prepare it well. And doing it on my phone sometimes was just a hassle.
Yeah, it got to be a little more than I was anticipating as well.
Absolutely. But it was really good. And so we both wanted to actually have a discussion here and attempt recording it and see what comes from this because it's really important that as we start talking about like a scientific method to jiu-jitsu that we're challenging each other's beliefs and ideas and presenting evidence and having these discussions because we can absolutely learn stuff from each other. Just because I'm a black belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu does not mean that I know everything. The whole idea of the scientific method is that I'm just making observations and trying to draw results from that stuff based on the evidence that I'm seeing. And I'm always open for new information. So, for those of you, hopefully, you have watched that previous video that I posted on my YouTube. Check it out, developing a submission system. If you haven't, just a quick recap is I am all about the idea that we've taken from Danaher guys, which are that submissions need to one be mechanically strong. So we need to see documented breaks at the highest level for us to really be super interested in working on these. And that the submissions need to be tactically plausible. So we need to have ways that we can control it, like a position to be able to break one's alignment, our opponent's alignment, to be able to create vulnerability and actually finish them. It needs to connect to other submission systems so that we have fail safes in place. We need to be able to enter that submission safely without the risk of giving up position. One of the arguments I made in the video was the Peruvian necktie. I personally don't like it because you go into a position where you sit down to your butt. And while there are possibly counter arguments to it, I think that it's too much of a risk to end up on bottom. We should never risk top position and that dominance for some Hail Mary that possibly gets us reversed. And then we have to have exit plans. So if you go into a submission and you don't have a way to make sure that your guard does not get past, once again, that you do not give up top position, give up any range that would play to the benefit of your opponent, then it's not something that I'm personally interested in. And with that comes talking about certain submissions. I shit on calf slicers as I did in a previous video year before. I wasn't a fan, and still not at this point, of chest compressors, but Jay here obviously has some very good points and insight that we're going to talk about. And I'm very excited for that. Talking about things like bicep slicers, any submissions, like key lock, the Americana from top side control, stuff that gets taught usually at a lower level that people focus too much time on. And then my argument is that leads to an inefficient progress of their jujitsu. And it really sucks because I've gone through this where I have certain submissions, moves that I like, guard passes, anything that then as I get to white belt to blue belt to purple belt to brown belt, I start hitting these walls where I find that these techniques that were my bread and butter at white belt no longer fly at blue and purple. And it was a real pain in the ass for me to have to relearn stuff and completely scrap things over time because I lacked the proper instruction. And I picked up lots of crap off of YouTube channels like Submissions 101, where the stuff was low percentage and I didn't know any better and I wasted my time on that. And so I have the approach that if we are not the people that are able to test this stuff in a strong manner that's going to create effective results and not lead to false positives, that we should be sticking to, especially at the early stages, sticking to the most effective stuff that's been laid out to us. And so Jay, take it away.
Okay, so as you described it there, I think I agree with just about everything. Definitely, I agree. It's important to have submissions that actually work. It puts someone to sleep or will break something. It's important to have all the different exit strategies and combinations and stuff. One of the big things that I have a different take on it is how we determine whether or not something holds. Like you're saying, if you see it all the time in high level competition, it's probably pretty valid. However, I think there are a lot of things that are quite effective that don't show up in high level competition, not because they're no good, or not even because they're no good at high level competition, but just because it hasn't really been competently tried yet. And so we just don't really know. So I think that there are ways that we can and should explore how things work, what is good jujitsu, without just trying to completely defer to what we see in current high level competition. And separately, I think that when you go about learning jujitsu, I think you have to do more than just try to copy what you see in the high level. I think that you have to do things. You have to try to understand what you're seeing and what you're doing. And I think a lot of times that calls for a lot more personal experimentation than you might otherwise think. Like even for things where people already know the answers, you still I think there's a lot of room for learning things yourself.
I absolutely agree with both those. Now, the first part where I think we're very much on the same page still is that being careful who are the people that are testing this stuff. So, yes, we want to see the stuff that works at the highest level, but you're absolutely correct that there are some things that haven't been tested yet. The example that you had brought up in our Reddit discussion was heel hooks, where heel hooks came a long way in the last 5 years, specifically set out from John Danaher and his Danaher Death Squad. These guys really shaped the way that the braking mechanics were applied, but more importantly, the tactical plausibility where they started to use these positions of control like standard ashy, cross ashy, outside ashy. And now we've seen even more evolution to this now from Craig Jones and Lachlan Giles working on the outside Sankaku and really taking 50-50, 80-20 even further. And so I agree with your argument that, well, certain things have not been developed yet. And if people do not push the envelope and try and innovate and test this stuff, then the sport will stagnate or we don't ever actually get the answers to this. Now, for me, I'm kind of doubling down on the extreme that a lot of us are just not the proper scientists of jujitsu, the guys that are good enough to be able to do this while cutting out false positives. So when we're talking about false positives, like it's usually used in the medical field, it's an error in data recording in which a test result improperly indicates presence of a condition. So you get an AIDS test, you don't actually have AIDS, but the test come back as AIDS. That's a false positive, and that would suck. But it's better than actually having AIDS. Now, if it's we're looking at jujitsu, if I'm doing a submission, so say look at the calf slicer, because I think the calf slicer for the most part is garbage when it comes to being mechanically strong and putting people away. If I put somebody in a calf slicer at my gym and they tap, I would infer from that when I was newer that calf slicers are awesome and I was able to submit this person. And I would probably even think that I could break this person's leg if they did not tap to it. Now, this person could have tapped for multiple reasons, but they could have tapped because they just don't know leg lock defense. They're totally ignorant when it comes to calf slicers. They might have a pre existing knee injury. They might be completely scared of going further into like a calf slicer defense because most of us are hobbyists in jujitsu and it's not worth risking having our leg popped, especially catastrophically damaged, that would affect us from being able to look after our family and to keep our jobs. And so a lot of us, like for me, I'm going to tap to a calf slicer probably. If I'm really warmed up, I might try and eat it a little bit longer. But if somebody taps me with a calf slicer, I know it's going to happen one day. And especially because of my videos shitting on this stuff, people are going to laugh and be like, we got him. But I am not the person that people should be trying to tap. Like I am still black belt and I'm not bad at jujitsu. And so it's a better bar than tapping somebody who has no grappling experience. But for us, we want to be able to use submissions that work at the highest level. And so this is going to be against people like Kyle Terra, Gordon Ryan, etc. These guys that are better endurance. They are possibly using steroids. Not that Kyle Terra is using steroids at all. You can see that. But Kyle Terra is also extremely flexible. And so that's a big thing that we see with guys. Once you start to get to like the top 1% of jiu-jitsu practitioners, these guys are the apex humans with in certain physicalities. They're going to be more flexible, they're going to be stronger, etc. And so if we don't have a submission that can actually damage somebody at that level that catastrophically destroys a joint, it's very difficult to make the argument for it. Now, there is once again people have to test this stuff and it's important that that is a robust testing method that takes time. And so if we look at John Danaher and we look at leg locks and the scientific method to that, heel hooks arguably were still mechanically strong. Like that's why there was a lot of people scared of using heel hooks and why it was kind of like the dark side of jiu-jitsu. And a lot of people don't train it is because it was done uncontrolled and people got hurt. Now, what they did is they totally changed the tactical plausibility and thus increased the braking mechanics further and make it mechanically stronger. So John Danaher asked a question: why aren't we seeing leg locks? Or he got like was I can't remember if it was Dean Lister that said, why would you ignore 50% of the human body? And then that's what really sparked Danaher to really go down this rabbit hole. You do background research, you research that area, and you see what people have been trying to do before you. For this, for us, for a lot of submissions, it's much easier because we can just observe what guys are doing at the highest level. But back then, leg locks weren't being used as much or they were frowned upon. So then constructing a hypothesis, starting to come up with different techniques, the ways that they created wedges to control the knee line, and how they started using positions interchangeably to form a hierarchy of control. This was some of the stuff they talked about. And then they also changed how some of the braking mechanics were applied. Then they tested it. And this is where I think most of us just can't do this, where we're not competing on a regular basis and testing this stuff and moving up to higher levels of competition. Just because I win a jiu-jitsu competition in British Columbia, Canada, it it doesn't really mean much. It's a starting point. And so I do not disagree that there's a slow implementation to this. But if I'm not able to be that person that goes out and competes at higher levels to test this stuff, then I have to be very careful with how I'm analyzing the data and communicating the results. And that's what I really hate about jujitsu online is that we see guys that just come up with a move in their gym. And whether it's 10th planet techniques, some of them I really don't like, or we have this low percentage stuff that's just super Instagram, YouTube clickbaity, and they want to share that stuff to people immediately because it gets them views and it's got this self interest where we need to be able to analyze. Like John Danaher did this in the right way. They withheld information for the competitive edge, but when he did release that instructional on entering the system with leg locks, he had gone through this stuff and it had been tested so thoroughly. And we have everyone knew who the Danaher Death Squad guys were at the highest level. That we're like, yeah, okay, this has completely changed the meta of the techniques within jiu-jitsu, and that works. I think that at least looking at myself and most of the grapplers, when we're talking about a certain technique, we could start striving towards trying to improve those techniques and make some innovations in the sport. But the testing methods, we got to be super careful with how we approach that, and we got to be super mindful with how we try and communicate the results of that information to other people, so we're not just slinging bullshit and trying to sell ourselves.
Well, you said a lot of things. I have a lot of responses to. Let's see if I can remember all of them.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to discuss.
So the first thing that I think is worth pointing out is that you can get false pot like a Darce choke is a pretty strong choke. There's a lot of it's not super rare. It's not the Renica choke, but it's not super rare in high level competition. It's one of the ones I do best at. But even there, I get a lot of false pauses in the gym, just like you're talking about the calf slicers, where people tap not because they're about to go to sleep, but because they assume that they can't escape it, or because it's starting to choke or something. And I actually get someone Darce choke was good, and I had it just right, and not tapping and like not falling asleep, and it was like, okay, what the hell's going on here? It casts everything into doubt. And that's not because Darce choke can't put people to sleep. It's just because someone is good at that move and can get submissions with doesn't mean you are. And so while I agree you want to not get false encouragement, I think it's something that we have to be really careful about, even when we do use, like, even at rear naked choke. I've had people, I can feel like I got it down, and then roll with someone who's like really good, and they start escaping, and it's like, shit, how did that happen? That wasn't supposed to happen, you know?
No, I agree with that. I guess in that sense, we're almost looking at the false negative where you have something that should work, but it's not. And it is always going to be, especially as we're looking at going through the different stages of white, blue, purple, brown, black. There are techniques like arm triangles. I think we discussed lightly in Reddit, or at least you had brought it up. I sucked at arm triangles until brown belt because the way that it's been taught for so long is so garbage that, especially at my body type, my lack of biceps and the technique I was trying to use, it sucked. And so I walked away from it for many years until Ryan Hall came out with his instructional on how to finish it properly. And once I learned how to properly internally rotate the shoulder and to occlude my opponent's arteries on the one side, which is where I always had the problem with, then I was able to finally start finding success with that. But at least there was still evidence showing that there are Darce chokes or arm triangles still being done at higher levels. And while they're not like something like a Darce might not be seen as often, I do think that the tactical plausibility of it makes them much safer to go for because they tie in so well to passing, they tie in so well to anacondas and head and arm guillotines that I don't have a problem with Darce chokes because guys like Bill Cooper and Edwin Najimy have done them at very high levels.
All right, so that leads into my next point, which is the way you're using false positive. Like it depends on what you're trying to use the test as a test of. It sounds like the way you're using it sounds like you're saying a false negative is this move, roughly like loosely defined as Darce or capsizer or whatever, is something that is viable at high level competition, rather than the specific claim of, am I going to be able to tap this person? Am I going to be able to break this person or put them to sleep. And I think often it can be really important to look at the finer distinctions because what some people will call this an arm triangle, and it's like it looks like there's a lot of things people will call arm triangles with pretty different finishing mechanics and different value. And it can be the case that even though some people get results at high level, what you're actually doing, you have a choke like arm triangle, and it sort of works at high level. All right, that's good enough. But when you try to do it, you still get taps. And so we think, hey, I'm getting success, but it doesn't mean that if you get someone good in an arm triangle, you'll succeed because you're not actually doing the same arm triangle. And so you have to be a little careful when you say a false positive. Are you saying um, that this move, in some variation, somewhere near what I'm doing, has value at high level, or is it I can actually succeed in doing damage or finishing this submission on the person I'm doing it on? And it could be often really substantial differences between the two. That makes sense.
Yeah, and another part to that, there's like kind of a third aspect to submissions that I don't talk about too often, but it's kind of I think where we're kind of circling around right now, where to me they need to be conceptually sound, depending on the framework that you're using, so that you can actually understand what's happening within the submissions. And there can be other belief systems too. It's like so for me, another belief for me when it comes to submissions, when it being conceptually sound, is that I have to be able to do this when I'm not warmed up, and it's something that doesn't put me in compromised alignment. So something like a go-go plata could even be a mechanically strong submission that we're seeing become a little more tactically plausible. I still don't like it because self-defense is important to me, and I'm not going to be able to pull off bringing my leg up to my head immediately. But when we focus on the conceptual part, this is where it's really important that we have a conceptual understanding of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, whatever that looks like for us. We focus on alignment, which is the proper positioning of our body relative to our goals to generate force and absorb force. And it's constructed of structure, posture, and base. So, structure being the efficient, effective positioning of your limbs, base being a platform for which to apply and absorb force, and posture being keeping your spine relatively straight so that you have it in strong integrity so that you're going to be able to generate force and have your upper and lower body act as a kinetic chain. When you start to understand then also leverage and frames and wedges and all these things that make jujitsu extremely complicated because grappling is not a very simple sport or martial art, you need to be able to decipher what are these moves and what is being done and how are you doing something similarly. So I still think that for me, when I reflect back on my first competition at blue belt, arm bars, high level, you can see arm bars being done at a high level, even at ADCC. You see guys get their arms substantially injured if they don't tap to it. And yet, when I went into competition and I started trying to armbar guys, there was about 3 guys where I got the armbar fully extended and I was not able to finish them because my braking mechanics were just weak in that last
Actually,
5%
this brings up
because
a really good point.
yeah, because
Like, but real quick,
yeah,
I hated arm bars for the longest time. I thought arm bars are stupid. I'm never going to learn to do arm bars, and I just I completely put them aside because I never saw really definitive breaks at high level. I saw a lot of people tapping to them, a lot of people getting slightly hyperextended arms, but I saw a lot of people, Vinny Magalhaes and Verdun being, the obvious one, but a lot more people than that failing to finish arm bars. And I thought it's just not that strong of a submission. And now I have a completely different take on it because I've seen more devastating breaks and they understand how to do it better. But I just thought that was interesting because I kind of had the same experience, but in reverse almost. Does that make sense?
yeah, absolutely. And I think certainly some submissions, like even arm bars, you still see more guys walk away shaking their arm out, but it's not certainly devastated. Same like knee bars, you don't usually see the knee go completely backwards to a point where a guy can't walk away like they do with heel hooks. But we'd still look at while there might not be documented breaks as often or much at all at the highest level, if I'm seeing a black belt at the finals of worlds tapping to something, then I know that this person is willing to put their freaking limbs on the line and tap at the last available second versus like say me at the gym or me in a lower level competition. I'm just going to tap immediately because I want to be able to train tomorrow. I want to be able to go to work the next day. So when we start seeing high level guys still having to tap to it, we want to be careful with it, as you said. But if they're tapping to it, then we're going to probably be covering our bases where everybody underneath those people are going to be tapping to it. And so when we're looking at like the concepts of something, we need to know exactly how it works. And this is where I think it's so important for people upwards towards purple belt, even some brown belts, because not all belts are created equal depending on the standards of certain gym owners and instructors. that you got to be so careful about when we're venturing off trying to innovate things on our own or create our own variations of techniques, because we're pretty ignorant. It'd be like going into first year, second year of biology and thinking like we're going to change the world, we're going to completely change a way that people view this one thing in biology or try and cure cancer. Can it be done? I mean, yeah, arguably, but it's going to be a lot of work, and there's only a select few individuals that I think possess those kind of skills at such an early stage that are going to be able to be those geniuses to do that. So for me, when I teach techniques, I try and teach something so that it would be the most fundamentally conceptually sound way to teach it, that the average body would be able to perform it on each other. And there'll have to be some variations for someone who, say, is 350 pounds and can't perform certain functional movements. We'll have to make those adjustments, but I'm going to teach it the same. And then for me, for myself personally, the way that I grapple now, the way I drill some of my techniques as a black belt, I'm 6'5", 175 pounds usually on any given day. I'm extremely lanky. I'm very long. My arms and legs are longer than most people, even getting close to my height. And so now I'm starting to create these variations based on my attributes or the ways that I really personally like to do these techniques, that I'm able to exploit my strengths now. But if I was to teach somebody to try and finish a submission like a Japanese necktie, or finish, I could even do a fundamentally poor Darce in some ways and still be more successful with it. But it's not my game personally. But the way I pressure pass, I can control people's heads while I can also control their legs just because of how long I am. But if I try to teach people that method, then it's just not going to work for people. And so, kind of coming back to your argument, if we're seeing submissions at the higher levels for something, we got to make sure we actually know how we're replicating it. Easier said than done. Hopefully you have a conceptual understanding, you can view jiu-jitsu and break it down when you're reviewing competition footage, or hopefully you have a high enough quality instructor, or at least other people at your gym could have multiple resources that you could pull from that are going to be able to show you how to do that. Because if I'm trying to do a arm triangle and I just can't make it work, and I'm thinking what the hell's going on, I should still be able to look and see that people are finishing arm triangles at the high level, and just know that from a growth mindset that I suck, and that I need to refine my skill and make myself better, which is ultimately what jiu-jitsu is. You can have techniques that you can have that arm triangle work on white belts. You're starting to get the basis for it, but realistically, you're not going to tap blue belts with it or anybody above. And then once you start to hit that blue belt level, your arm triangle starts to get to whatever that blue belt level would be defined as. And you can start to hit your blue belt counterparts with it. But you can never, good luck hitting your black belt instructor with it. And so it has to keep being refined. But as long as we're seeing a lack of a ceiling, in a sense, where we're seeing those arm triangles still being hit at the highest level, if you're seeing arm bars and heel hooks happening at ADCC, you can know and confidently train that technique, knowing that you're going to be able to keep taking that with you versus, say, hitting a ceiling at like purple belt.
Yeah, I think anytime you can see a ceiling, stop and do something else. Um, hard agree
I
there.
agree. Yeah.
I guess right. My view is tends to be that if you can't see the ceiling, try to find it, and if you can't find it, when you keep looking, eventually you get something cool. And if it's new, then it's new. If it's not, then it's not. So you talk a lot about principles like your posture and structure, right? As
Yep.
your way of understanding jujitsu. And so my question for you now is, if you look at someone doing, um, say, an arm triangle, and you say, hey, or maybe I shouldn't say arm triangle, but you look at someone doing some submission, and you say, hey, that submission is wrong according to my principles. Their structure should be like this instead. That's more efficient. But you never see anyone doing it in the high levels there. What do you conclude from that?
That's an absolutely a great point. And that's where there could certainly be certain innovations. Now, there can be, I talked about this also in the Reddit, where I'm okay with possibly trying to innovate at small levels. And so my instructor and I, we come up with slight variations for leg locks and stuff like that, transitional movements, passes that we like for our body types that we think are grounded in reality still from a conceptual standpoint, because I think we have a very high level of understanding for concepts of how we personally view jujitsu. But it's also grounded in the reality where it's something where it's like, okay, here is a transitional movement that John Danaher teaches and Gordon Ryan teaches. And then here's another movement that's different that Lachlan Giles teaches of how to move into, say, standard Ashi into the backside 50-50. And now, what if we take those and we chain them together in a way with some slight variations to stuff that we think would still be conceptually sound, that kind of meets that framework that we have to have, that's robust and meets the criteria, then I'm fine with starting to try and innovate with that. But once again, we're talking two black belts here. And Rob Bernacki, my instructor, I think is a very high level black belt that is starting to prove it now late in competition, but he's very well known now, even worldwide, as an instructor. Whether you like him, his personality or not, is the thing that people always end up debating, but he's got a good level of understanding of jiu-jitsu. So when we got guys that are black belts or brown belts or even very confident purple belts, I'm not as against the idea of starting to work on that stuff. But like I said, there's going to be a responsibility where the stuff that Rob and I are working on, I'm not just going to create an instructional or release videos saying like, "Hey, here's the new cool transition from here to here." If I do it, I would do it in the way that I don't know if you follow Rob Deagle at all, but he is a black belt. Can't remember if he got the black belt from John Danaher, but he trains with John Danaher in the blue basement, and he's been a high level competitor. When he's working on stuff and creating little innovations, he releases stuff on Instagram, but he always says that he's doing it under the caveat that he is doing this for his own mental retention so that he has a video to kind of refer back on and stuff that he's experimenting with. And that is purely from a food for thought aspect where he wants people to see it. And this is where the community can now start extrapolating on that and starting to try and take their own avenues with it and create stuff, which is amazing. But he's doing it from this responsible perspective where he's just kind of like, hey, I'm testing this. It's not proven, but if you guys like it and you want to try and take this a bit further, then that's fantastic. And I really like that mindset. And so I'm not against the idea of innovation. We just have to be careful with how we do it and how we present it to others.
Right. So qualifying things you think you know is super important. Hey, here's the thing I'm playing with is a lot different than here's the thing that's been proven in competition when it hasn't. But I guess the question is like if you look at the old fashioned heel hooks, right, and you compare them to how people are doing heel hooks these days, it's not really that subtle a difference. It's a really big conceptual difference. Are you trying to grab the heel and twist, like kind of log roll yourself and try to spin faster than they spin, or are you trying to position things in such a way that you bridge in and you break things without really caring what your relative rotation rate, or without really caring if both of you rotate at the same time because you're trying to twist it in a way that they can't spin out of. Right? It's a very fundamental difference. And so back up 5, 10 years, whatever it takes. If you sit down and you think about heel hooks and you say, okay, well, this fundamental problem with heel hooks is that people are spinning out. So why don't we try to find a way to stop that? And then you think about it and you say, oh, well, here's one thing I can do. If their leg is bent and I put upward force on their knee and downward force on their hip, it causes them to rotate in the opposite direction that my heel toe pressure torque is rotating them. And therefore, I can break them even if we both roll. It seems to me that arguments like that are strong enough that even if no one in the high level has figured it out and done it yet, I'm still going to put my money on that being solid. And I'm going to put my money on that being solid, even if it came from a blue belt. And I'm going to start practicing that way. And while I won't say it's proven, if someone asks me like, what way are you going to train? What way are you going to, if you have to bet your life on heel hook one way or another, I'm betting my life on the heel hook that works in a way that makes sense rather than one that works the way that the best guys have done it when they haven't tried otherwise.
I don't disagree with that. I think it's very difficult to figure out ways of doing that stuff on our own, depending on who we have as training partners, as I said, and to make sure that we're being very careful of ways to not generate these false positives. And I don't disagree with you that depending on what your conceptual framework is, that is something that we need to always be looking at as a criteria. And if I'm not checking these boxes of, say, posture, structure, and base, frames, levers, wedges, center of gravity being controlled, what am I doing to control my own momentum or my opponent's momentum, then that can be ultimately that important governing factor. But then, as I said, and I think we're very much still on the same kind of basis of this, it's like there needs to be like a testing of that. And so for you, if you think like there's something that's a more fundamental way, then you start looking at that. And that's fine. It just comes down to what your kind of goals are and how much you're training, because that's kind of been like the main basis for my argument is that for most people, we're only, say, training 2 to 8 hours a week, like 2 to 4 classes. And so depending on how much time you have, depending on all your other responsibilities, family, work, etc., how much time do you want to dedicate to that stuff? If you have a blast doing it and you're very realistic with yourself that you could chase rabbit holes and end up drawing conclusions that just kind of throw all your work out the window for the last month, then that's totally fine. But if we want to try and efficiently maximize our time to be able to become as effective as fast as possible, which I think is a very realistic goal for a lot of people, whether you're doing it for self-defense purposes or if you're doing it just because you want to be able to have fun. Winning is fun. And some people really draw inspiration from the idea of one to try and be inventive and innovative, kind of as we've touched upon. So that's totally cool. But lower levels, really important that we focus on stuff that is proven and giving them the tools to be able to think critically and be able to challenge stuff. And then if they want to start going down those roads, we touch upon this in Reddit as well, that depending on what the questions are that they're asking of me, of Rob, hopefully we have the answers to be able to either shut something down soundly so that we just end that argument there and they know not to chase that rabbit hole if it's something that is proven over and over again to be just garbage. Or are they asking a question that's very interesting that we want to help them try and extrapolate on even further? Is it something that then we want to take to my instructor's instructor, Kyle Terra, and ask him questions because we know that Kyle's testing that stuff at the highest level and is constantly training with high level guys. We have people that we're able to check with to be able to look at this stuff just in the same way if we look at, I mean, any aspect of life that you're trying to specialize. But if we're looking at science, hopefully you have somebody that's a bit of a mentor to you that you're able to bounce those ideas off. And I don't disagree that somebody at a much lower level can still look at something from outside the box or from a different angle that could all of a sudden change it. Or like as we've talked about a little bit, and I want to start transitioning to, if we look at chest compressors in grappling, where jujitsu, we haven't really touched that very much. And so to me, I'm not personally interested in going down that rabbit hole because of just my limited training time and the stuff that I'm wanting to focus on that I know is proven, that is tying in well to my game and is generating success for me. But I'm certainly not against the idea that if then somebody with a wrestling background like yourself says that chest compressors are actually a lot more valid than I think, then I'm open to hearing that argument. And ultimately, as you've said, there's been certain things like the Baron Bolo and heel hooks, how they've been redefined. We look at Keenan Cornelius and the Meow Brothers with lapel guards, stuff that has been constantly changing that we never thought about before. And I think that's going to be something that continues to happen. It might get simpler and simpler to an extent because I think there's only so many big variations of things that we can change. But yeah, let's start talking about chest compressors, unless obviously whatever you want to respond to
Yeah, I
what I
still got
just said.
another issue with that first.
Of course.
Um, so they're definitely, like as you said, they're definitely different motives. If you want to be inventive, then that's one thing. If you want to look cool on Instagram to look cool on Instagram, that's one thing. But let's not confuse it with effective training. But at the same time, um, in order to learn how to do learn how to do a triangle effectively, you have to have the right concepts for knowing what you're looking at, even, right? You can't just be like, oh, you kind of cross your legs and squeeze. Like that doesn't mean anything. And so when you have someone like Ryan Hall that says, oh, well, don't try to just be in front of them and squeeze your legs together. You want to cut the angle and clamp down. You have principles like that that can help you. It help even a white belt get a lot better at their triangles, right?
100%. I
So,
don't disagree with that.
so I think that the concepts are super important, and I'm probably not a good central example for anything because I'm a very conceptual person, and I like to tie lots of things together and come up with better options for things. But separate from any desire to be inventive, when I look at when my submissions have gotten better, when they have like a real substantial improvement, it's not usually just from putting in more hours of doing the same thing over and over again. And sometimes it's from what people have taught me, but most of the time it's from actually having something click and I have a better conceptual understanding of what I'm trying to do. And sometimes it's something I've been taught anyway. It's like, oh, now I see what they're saying. But I mean, at least personally, I found it to be invaluable, even for even for my regular development on things like Darces and arm triangles, to really try to understand the concepts and to explore. And part of the understanding concepts is exploring different things as a way of testing your conceptual understanding. So I might be testing something that like I know isn't really that tactically plausible. I know I'm never gonna, it's not gonna be my A game. But if I try this, I might understand my concepts better, and that can lead to more mechanically sound interpretations of a Darce choke or something. I think that's something that I think is underestimated a lot of the time.
I don't disagree with that, and I apologize if I'm not conveying that part
Okay,
because when I'm all about the conceptual approach, and
right.
so the better you can further your conceptual knowledge of something, the better you're going to understand it. And we also discuss in Reddit where some people then think that because I say shit on Americanas from side control or that I shit on the calf slicer, that it never gets taught to my students, which isn't true. I want to teach them the stuff so that one, they can understand the concepts about why that stuff works. Because something like an Americana from side control, the basic figure four, mechanically strong still, and it can work on low level guys. I don't think you need to spend much time drilling it to be able to still pull it off against low level guys, but you can learn something from it. And by understanding external rotation of the shoulder and how to access the arm as a lever like that, we just saw Gordon Ryan finish a guy that I've trained with, Kyle Bame, who is a great grappler, finished him with a Americana style shoulder lock from inside a triangle. And so there's a very similar breaking mechanics, but done from a completely different position from within a triangle, in which I think then it becomes tactically plausible. Arguably a different submission, but it's the same shoulder lock. Then something like a calf slicer, I don't respect them. But once again, for me and my knee flexibility and limited range, while I'm not relying on this as a submission to spend a lot of time on to tap guys at a high level, I've still practiced it and studied it enough that I conceptually understand what's going on. So that one, it could supplement my game. Like if I end up in a truck position against somebody and they're not doing anything appropriate to defend and the calf slicer's right there, I'm not against trying that calf slicer because in that circumstance, it's tactically plausible that I'm not taking any risk. And so, as long as I'm not expending a lot of energy trying to do that, I'm absolutely cool using it as something to possibly try and supplement my game. And I know John Danaher says the same thing when it comes to stuff like the ankle lock or the calf slicer or bicep slicers. It's a supplement. It's something that can be a strong supplement to the strong systems that we already have in place. And obviously, we need to understand these techniques so that we can defend them because that is ultimately like the most important thing. Ignorance is the most dangerous thing in grappling. A bloody guard pass or guard retention movement can be dangerous if you perform it completely incorrectly and at the wrong time. So I need my students to understand how to finish these submissions so that they can further increase their conceptual understanding, but they're going to be told that these are not submissions that are seen yet at the highest level. Obviously, these things could change as we observe new information, but try not to base your entire game around calf slicers and around Americanas. And then once we start to get a bit of an understanding of how to finish them, hopefully then the students are going to be able to then start working on the defense, which is what we're going to show them, so that they know how to defend that Americana and know how to defend these calf slicers so that we're not sending them out into a competition or out into any kind of situation where they're going to be put in a submission they've never seen before, react poorly, and end up getting hurt because even a non-mechanically strong movement can still be very dangerous if the person doesn't know how to react appropriately.
Yeah, and I think a lot of I think so again, I think the concepts are big, and you want to teach people, but I wouldn't just teach them so they know how to avoid it, but teach them so they can find exactly why Americanas don't work on anyone that has some color on their belt. I mean, the standard white belt Americana is they don't know to turn to their side to release the shoulder pressure and put their torso in the way. And once you know how to do that, the whole thing falls apart. So you can teach that as you teach the standard white belt Americana as an example of how things can be not secure submissions. And I think it's different than just teaching so you don't get caught in this particular move, but teaching as a way of understanding the principles. And I think that the big place where we differ, and you do talk a lot about concepts a lot, and you definitely don't say that they aren't important, but I think they are so much more important than what you actually see in the high level. That if there's a disagreement, you should trust your concepts. Um, and I think that I also think this is hard. Like there's a lot of concepts that aren't uniformly applied or aren't uniformly uh, understood. When I apply my conceptual understanding to jiu-jitsu, I see a lot of things where like this doesn't add up. This should be done completely differently. And I feel like if it were fairly rare that I thought, oh, this seems like a better way of doing it, then I would probably say, oh yeah, like I feel like I'd talk more about it more similar to the way you do. But it's the way I see it. It's like very if I try to understand concepts and I follow them where they lead me, inevitably what I get is things working better for me against the people I actually compete against, and quite a few things that are pretty different than what you would normally see. So if you look at like calf slicers, for example, what why do they suck? I mean, you can see that they aren't super successful at high level competition, but like, why do they actually suck? Mechanically, what's wrong with them, right? And if we can understand that, then maybe there's no good solution, but maybe there is. And actually, I'd like to get your input on why calf slicers suck, specifically the one from the truck you're talking about, and I'll give my input about what I see we could potentially do about that. Though I don't necessarily think it would make that rescue that one into a great move, but I do think that there's something wrong with that as everyone does it.
Yeah, so if we look at submissions, joint locks, there are three kinds of joint locks. We have extension based, like arm bars or knee bars. We have rotation based, like Kimuras or heel hooks. And we have compression based, like bicep slicers and calf slicers. And compression based locks are statistically the lowest percentage, the ones that we're not seeing at the highest level. Now, when we look at what makes a submission more effective, I think the more we can combine those three aspects of extension, rotation base, and compression, we can make a submission more valid and more destructive. And so when we look at something like an armbar, when we look at the breaking mechanics of how an armbar has advanced over time, we are adding a rotation based element, sometimes external, a lot of times internal, to take further slack out of the joints, the muscles, tendons, and to be able to further compromise the alignment of our opponent, to then add the extension base, which is the bridging in, or saying like the heel hooks as you had talked about. The lower level was purely rotation. Guys grabbed it and ripped it across their body and tried to roll, and they didn't have very good control of the knee. Once they got better at creating wedges around the knee to hold it in place, we could look at adding rotation, internal or external rotation to the hip and knee. And then at that same point, also then add the bridging, which is adding an extension base into the submission. If we look at just the calf slicer, we are looking at a solely compression based submission in which someone is shoving the tibia and fibia in behind your opponent's knee, and you're going to be pushing it in as far as you can and compressing by pulling down at your opponent's ankle or preferably toes to access maximum leverage to fold it further than it should be able to. Now, the reason why I think it really sucks is that when we're looking at the majority of people at the higher level, there's going to be a certain functional range of motion where people are very comfortable at not only sitting like from a kneeling position, sitting back onto their heels, onto their feet, and being able to lean even further back from that position. And so when people can comfortably put their heels to their butt and even further past, it's very difficult for us to take a wedge that's not very big because we're taking just the bottom of like our shin by the ankle and shoving that in there. Even worse when we're talking about an arm in calf slicer. That I think is even more horse shit. Thinking that that's going to be enough of a wedge to be able to now inhibit somebody from being able to bend around it in a point that's going to be able to cause a lot of destruction. Because even when you see people getting arguably put in these calf slicers, even like the full bear trap variation where you've got behind them and you've grabbed their hips. Hoffa Mendes managed to get Cabrinha into a deep bear trap calf slicer in 80cc a long time ago. One, Cabrinha is really flexible. I bet it probably didn't even hurt him one bit, but it's obviously a very strong control position. So tactically, plausibility from that perspective. But at the same point, we need to look at catastrophic damage. And so I think a calf slicer, while you might even be able to pop some higher levels guys' knees, just that little pop, one or two pops where like stuff is starting to go a little bit, but with adrenaline, with that will to just let your joints go, that unless you're able to actually wreck this person's joint and put them away where they can't walk on that leg anymore and continue to fight, you're not going to be able to put people away. And I mean, arguably, we see that with outside heel hooks, where there's still a lot of outside heel hooks we've seen guys deep in that are unable to be finished. It does hurt them. You might even see them limp off the mat, but you see them still being able to fight for the rest of the round. Where inside heel hooks are known to be or recognized to be as the stronger submission to an outside heel hook because that one does typically devastate the knee in a much greater fashion. So if we're looking at a way of improving the calf slicer, because there's a way that we try to do it to improve it, though I still don't think it works that great, is we start trying to add a rotation based element to the calf slicer. And so I have a video on my YouTube, if you probably haven't seen it before, but I do talk about in my first calf slicer defense video how to kind of try and exploit external rotation. So rather than just grabbing at the ankle or the toes and pulling straight down, if the toes are able to be pointed up in some sort of manner and we can grab underneath from the back and grab the toes and start rotating the toes outwards to add external rotation to the hip, then we start to put further strain on the knee. And that I'm much more nervous about if somebody was able to grab my foot like that. It's very difficult to take somebody who's putting on the boot and using their leg that's mechanically much stronger than my arms and my ability to use my arms in the fashion to rotate it. But that was one way that we looked at calf slicers to add compression and rotation to make it more effective. But once again, not really tested too much and also very hard to do against somebody who's very good at defending calf slicers.
Okay, so your basic answer is that even with your shin in there, you can pull someone's heel to where it touches their butt, and it won't be catastrophic. And then there's nowhere else you can go from there, right?
Yeah, it's very difficult to go further than that. Like besides trying to add a rotation based element to it, because I don't think extension is the proper answer within the context of a calf slicer. Although obviously everything I say is one of those things that it can be if it's proven wrong, then I'd love to see it. And because that just innovates and that just causes further evolution to jujitsu as well as my own personal growth.
So I'm definitely gonna have to look up that match that you're talking about, um, because I haven't seen anyone get in a deep calf slicer of that type and not look like they're screaming in pain and tapping. So if that happens, that's cool. I gotta look that up. Um, but I think there's another problem with calf slicers though, as typically done. So if you get someone in a calf slicer from the truck, how easy do you think it's going to be for you to get their heel to touch their butt? Do you think
It's
it's like
it's very difficult to get it like if we're talking like that furthest range, it's very easy to create a pull, a stomp with your other shin into the back of your shin to push it up into the back of their knee and to pull it down the majority of the way. But if we are talking that last 5% to be able to actually push the foot to the person's butt, there's a direction change there that becomes much more difficult.
there's a direction change, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the part that strikes me is wrong. Like just the general principles of finishing submissions say that you should not be basically not having direction change by triangling your legs in the other direction or moving your whole body so that their upper leg rests on your other hip would get rid of that, right?
I still don't think that even if you're able to change it from like those positions, like say the bear trap, where you're able to force that the heel all the way to the butt, that I have not personally seen evidence that says that that's going to hurt people. Will it hurt me? 100%. Will it hurt you? I'm going to assume so based on what you're saying, and
I don't know.
that
I'm not pro calf slicer.
yeah, we
I
talked about that, but
I
yeah,
don't
so
I don't
I don't.
do them because it just hasn't been something that I've gotten into yet. And I'm pretty agnostic on how hard it is to do damage with the calf slicer.
Mhm.
I guess my point is that when I see people do the calf slicer from the truck, and I notice like that's just not the mechanically strong way to do the submission, and then I see people say, "Oh, it's not strong." Okay, is it there's something else making them not strong too, or maybe is it harder to get into the other position? Maybe, but it's also like okay, when I see people saying this submission isn't strong, and they're doing it in a way where the direction changes, so they can't pull the rest of the way. I think that might be part of it. And so I guess before thoroughly ruling it out, like I don't joint calf slicers. I don't expect it to be great, but before really ruling it out, I'd want to try doing it the right way, and see if I can find a way to get into that position. See if I can reliably generate enough torque to hurt people. And I guess it kind of gets to the question of how you even solve that. And I do have a bit of an interesting answer there. Going back to the heel hook thing, you talked about people trying outside heel hooks and kind of hurting people, but not really getting the tap. And whereas inside heel hooks pretty easily mess knees up. And so your conclusion is the inside heel hook is the stronger submission, right?
Mhm.
Um, I don't really agree with that. I think it's easier to finish inside heel hooks, but I think if you finish the outside heel hook correctly, you're going to break the person's tibia in half, as we've seen happen multiple times.
Yep.
And so I think that if provided that I'm going to be able to finish it properly, I would choose an outside heel hook, you know, easy because then the person can't walk at all, rather than being having a really hard time walking because their knee is shredded. You know, what the inside heel hook does, there's a few things that make it stand out. One is that you don't have the subtalar joint allowing the ankle to move in a way that makes it harder to twist. But another thing that I think most people probably don't really realize unless they're very in tune with their own anatomy is that it really focuses all of the torque or all the tension from inside heel hook gets focused on one ligament, one relatively weak ligament. So it takes very little to actually start doing damage. I actually built there's like you go to the doctor's office and you see a little model of the knee and they show you how it works.
Yep.
Yeah, so I bought one of those models and I beefed it up with fiberglass and I replaced the ligaments with dynamo, which is basically really strong cables, put strain gauges on them, and have myself a leg that perfectly mimics human leg and will tell me how much stress is on each ligament when I do various leg locks on
Cool.
it. And it's a pretty neat toy. But one of the things it showed is that the inside heel hook takes much less force than anything else to get ligaments to the point where they're going to break, and it's all really focused on the MCL. Whereas the outside heel hook, it more evenly distributes the tension over multiple ligaments, and that's why you get shin snapping first. But also, when it goes, you're gonna start getting more things popping. So I think that the inside heel hook to outside heel hook comparison makes things not completely trivial because they say like, hey, if I get a shitty attempt on a heel hook on a giant guy, I'm going to want it to be an inside heel hook. If it's some guy, some 150-pound meth head, or someone's on TCP and is not going to stop until like I think I'm going to be able to finish it. I want an outside hook because I want to be able to snap the shin in half. And so I think that stronger submission is not super well defined when you look at the details there.
I can't disagree with that. I think we have definitely seen some greater breaks at the higher level from an outside heel hook. I think when we start factoring, like, not just talking about mechanical strength, which then if we look at, say, the argument, we switch it and say the outside heel hook is mechanically stronger in the sense that it could cause further damage, although the inside heel hook would be more efficient in the sense that we can do damage sooner. I think arguing at a point where like these two heel hooks, I love both, but I do think that the inside heel hook then still will usually the positions that we are using to attack with the inside heel hook afford us more options for control to be able to isolate and
Mm,
control both legs, double trouble, that kind of stuff, as well
mm,
as follow ups. I mean, once again, I use both, and that's where like I guess my main argument, like I'm not trying to differentiate my time too much between inside heel hooks and outside heel hooks. I want to train both heel hooks and I want to focus my time on training those because once again, if I'm only say training 2 to 4 times a week average, if I'm focusing on heel hooks and then looking at how I can tie in knee bars and even toe holds, even though I don't think that they're as effective either, although we do still see some documented breaks and stuff, then I can easily tie that stuff together. Where a calf slicer, besides certain people, like there's obviously the response that if I'm doing an outside heel hook from standard ashigarami and they start rotating away from me, that's where we're able to start coming up, attacking the turtle and having their legs stuck in with our shin already behind their knee and start looking at like a calf slicer there. Which I'm not opposed to looking at it from there because that's also moving into the bear trap, which I think we both agree is basically like the strongest form of a calf slicer. Then I'm fine with that. But for me, what I'm just trying to say is that there's going to be certain submissions like the calf slicer that are just not strong enough and should could be used more as a supplement. But for my limited training time, like if I was training 40 hours a week and I want to chase calf slicers a bunch and try and refine them and take them to that next level, that's awesome. But I'm not realistically the guy to do that, and I don't have the time. So for me, best bang for my buck, I'm going in there, I'm working the shit out of heel hooks, and as long as heel hooks continue to just keep innovating and becoming better and better, which they are, then I'm just going to keep trying to stay up with that because that's a ton of information itself. Like I knew a lot about heel hooks already, but then as Danaher releases more information, and then obviously the massive instructional that Lachlan Giles put out, changing the whole outside Senkaku and 50-50, there all of a sudden 50-50 became a position that I didn't care about as much because it was 50-50 and everyone got very comfortable with defending it once it first came out from Ryan Hall's success, and so it fell to the wayside. And then as somebody innovated this and took it to the next level, I look at this and just go, "Sweet, here's this position that I disregarded for a while. Somebody else put that work in and took it." And so I mean, we're always going to be standing on the shoulders of giants where we can see what these other people are doing and at the highest level where I know that I can make this technique work regardless if this is against a meth head that's attacking me on the street or possibly even a high level black belt if I was say good enough to actually get them in a position which against yeah, the high level guys, I'm not that guy. But if I'm training to beat world level black belts, I cover everything underneath. And if I put somebody in like a calf slicer, is there a way that could be done differently? Possibly. I think that other people have certainly tried just because of how long it's been around. I don't know the exact background research of what people have tried and what variations they have done. And so that's the kind of stuff through a scientific method that, say, someone like yourself, if you're looking at this differently and you're doing research and you're seeing these issues of why it's not occurring at the highest level and how it could be done better, then that's awesome. And if you're motivated to do that, that's not something I want to discourage, but you're also a person that has, as we had discussed, like roughly like 5 years of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu experience, and then you started wrestling, I think, as early as middle school. You had said,
Hmm.
yeah. And so here's a person where you got more information, you possibly train a lot, and you're also trying to conceptualize the information and really understand the behind the scenes of why this stuff works, which is also something that I really try and do. If you're wanting to take that information and you're wanting to try and innovate and change certain things and make them more effective, then power to you. You seem to have enough things in place to filter out what is possibly garbage and have a smart enough approach to know what you're doing. Where the biggest problem I have is when you got guys doing, say, like when we look at the crazy stuff that 10th Planet keeps coming up with. And while some of it has been shown to be successful, you get guys like Kyle Bame, who is a 10th Planet guy, but I never see Kyle use rubber guard. I very seldomly, I can't even recall last time I've seen him use lockdown. There's these aspects within the system of 10th Planet that then people will be like, hey, 10th Planet works. Look at this competitor. And it's like, well, he's not actually using any of those techniques. That was like the big thing that started like the subculture of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu was with 10th Planet. Now, it's not for me. I don't think it works at the highest level. And I think it's had its time, say, like rubber guard to prove itself, though it has instances in MMA and stuff that's it served its purpose. But it's one of those things that I think it's still for the greater good of jiu-jitsu to have these subcultures where people are challenging the ideas and taking it down different rabbit holes because there's the odd things from 10th Planet, like the stuff they do from the truck and whatnot, not like high level leg locks, but the way different ways they look to control and get to the back and stuff. That it's like, okay, we're adding something to jiu-jitsu. And so it ultimately comes down to making sure that you just understand the limitations that you might face as you're trying to go in these certain paths and time that you're going to spend. Because I've tried to innovate stuff before, and some stuff we still like and we use, but there's been a lot of times that Rob and I have chased a technique for like 2 to 3 months, and then finally somebody hits us with something that we're like, oh, we didn't account for that variation. We didn't think about that defense. We didn't think, and it's just like, oh, all right, that's done. We're just gonna we're gonna have to try and find a way to address that. And sometimes stuff is just like, oh no, this is actually all crap, and we're gonna just move on from that. But we spend a very select amount of time for us to experiment with this stuff and further our understandings of concepts and challenge ourselves, which sounds like something that we're very close to in agreement in. Obviously, there's just some different kind of context of how we're talking about it slash not knowing the entire side of both of us. So as we're kind of revealing information, we're kind of seeing where it's like, oh, okay, we do actually see that as the in the same light. But obviously, we're just kind of figuring this out as we get to learn who we are.
So I actually trained at a 10th Planet, by the way.
You train at 10th Planet?
Yeah.
Nice.
I still make
I studied
friends.
it from the books. Like it wasn't obviously the best, and I'm not getting it straight from the source. But 10th Planet was my main 4 years of my training when I first started.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I don't really do any of the 10th Planet stuff in particular. It's not. I don't really have any strong opinion either way on it, but I just it's not the direction I want to go. I think that the thing that you dislike the most is when you see people chasing all this stuff that's just fundamentally flawed, right? And you feel like you spend a bunch of time working on something, and then but it's never going to work because it's fundamentally a bad move. And I think that the better way to see that is not mat time that matters. It's clarity of thought. So, like for example, I was someone at 10th Planet was working on this leg lock thing, and they showed it to me. It's like, oh, this is our secret move, and I was kind of thinking like, this is, I don't know. It struck me as being too focused on a single technique and missing the bigger picture of having refining the fundamentals of control. And so even at that point, I thought this is just fundamentally misguided strategically, and it's not like even if it's a great technique, which it didn't turn out to be in my estimation. But it's not. You have to know how to think. So like this particular move, I was watching him compete against some real leg lockers and try it, and then just flat out didn't work. And I look at it and I'm like, well, that was never going to work. Of course it doesn't work because there's a giant flaw here. And I think you just have to have the conceptual understanding that works well to find the flaws. And I think that is less based, like, I think that when I was a white belt, and still had a lot of wrestling experience, but I was coming up with conceptual differences that changed, that I was learning from, and some things were different than I've been taught. But I think it was mostly, come from my background studying physics rather than grappling. And it's like the chest compressor stuff. It's funny how similar it is to what I used to do in wrestling, and also how little it has to do with like the mechanical the innovations I'm making on making it work really have nothing to do with my wrestling background. Because like in wrestling, I did make someone tap out to it once because I don't know, whatever. It's just a little freshman in high school, and the guy wasn't, I mean, it wasn't a serious competition thing. But the way I do it now is pretty different, and those transitions to mount never happened in wrestling because you pin the guy, and all you have to do is hold him there and touch his shoulder blades to the mat. Whereas what it actually was trying to figure out how, like, what do guillotines and straight ankle locks and everything have in common, and then trying to think how would I apply this to the chest compressor, because like, for a while like, I don't know how strong this thing's supposed to be. It's not common enough. You see, okay, I saw Dean Lister tap to it against Josh Barnett, who's huge, but like that doesn't really tell me much, right? Like, I don't know if I'm hitting it right or if I'm not hitting it right. And so what I had to do was think about and call on my conceptual understanding of just finishing submissions in general, and in particular, in this case, it's I think a really strong principle is that you should finish, if you can finish it with your hips, finish it with your hips. And that means placing the thing you're trying to bend on your hips. So, for example, a straight ankle lock, I don't see anyone teach it this way except for Aoki does. And it did on one video I saw where you actually will, and people talk about getting your hand high, right? And you pick your shoulder up. Whereas Aoki
Yep.
does something that looks different. And it really isn't. I mean, it's not either or. He tried to do both, but he tried to get their foot down on his hip, and then he would curl his body sideways, like you would finishing a guillotine, or like you would pre-tensioning a heel hook. And that way, the ankle is right on the hip, and there's no inefficiency in the transfer of torque there, and it gets really freaking tight really fast. To the point where I think it's likely I could just break shins with it if I wanted to. I can't confirm that yet, so I haven't broken anyone's leg, thankfully, and
You test that shit for me. Break some shins.
I'll test. I do plan on getting. I still have to finish that leg thing, but I do plan on figuring out exactly how much torque I can make, and we have decent data on how strong human tibias and fibulas are. So I'll let you know when I have a strong answer. Um, but I think that it basically gets a lot stronger when you put things on your hip. And so the chest compressor thing, I just did the same thing. Say, okay, instead of I'm trying to bend their neck and upper chest, and so what you see is you see people with their hips getting far away from the body, similar to getting their ankle up by your chest and away from your hips. And if you just kind of post on your head, scoot up a little bit, so your hips sink down to like armpit level, it gets really really tight to the point where you just can't breathe at all if you're doing it right. And people are finishing in competition that weigh 165 pounds, 140 pounds or something, and it's so much stronger because you're actually doing it correctly. But I didn't do it that way in wrestling, because I didn't need to in wrestling, and we don't see like Josh Barnett doesn't do it that way. I mean, he doesn't need to. So I just think that there are a lot of things like that, like the ankle lock and like the chest compressor. Even if you are not trying to be super inventive, just trying to do standard moves, like an ankle lock's a standard move. You're just trying to do it right. You want to test your conceptual understanding and kind of have that expressed through jujitsu wherever it is. I mean, it's sort of like I mentioned, the Reddit thing. The Ryan Hall approach is very different than the Danaher approach, right? Danaher says, here are specific motions, you can have a flow chart for what Danaher says. And where Ryan Hall was like, okay, well, here's the principle. So do it this way, do it this way. Here's this completely ridiculous way that won't actually work, but if I could do this, it would work. And I think that kind of focus on the abstract principles is generally underrated because of how many flaws in your jujitsu it will show. I think if you really look for like where's my conceptual understanding wrong, and where's my actual moves wrong, it's just that stuff's everywhere. Um, and I think that's the reason you don't see ankle locks in high level. I mean, maybe at low weights you can't break a tibia. I wouldn't surprise me, but yeah. So I think it's like I think that there's so many things like calf slicers. Still probably not, but I think ankle locks, at least in heavyweights, like Tex Johnson. If you look like that guy, I think ankle locks can be high percentage. And chest compressors, I think like so I got a way of the hard part about getting an arm triangle is getting the arm across, right? Like once you have your head, your arm off your head, you kind of it's like locking your legs on a triangle. You kind of have the submission. You're not there yet, but that's sort of the big hurdle, right? So if you can get Keisakatami, you can use your hips to kind of push that over, and it's really really hard to stop. It's kind of like using it like Ryan Hall talked about finishing a triangle. It doesn't matter what side their arm is on. And it's a similar sort of thing. It doesn't matter what side their arm is on for arm triangle if you understand these principles and treat it, just cut the right angle. So like if you get like a regular leg triangle, and if you can cut the corner, which isn't always easy, but if you can cut the corner, then you don't have to worry about which side of their arm your body is, right, or vice versa. It just the arm becomes a non-issue if you can cut the angle, right? Similar thing happens with a Darce. If they trying to get an underhook, you can kind of you fall towards their head anyway, and then that pulls their arm up where it should be, and then you can hip in, and it becomes a non-issue. So I was trying to think, how do I apply this to the arm triangle? And if there's, I can't come up with credit. I can't credit myself for doing it. First, I saw like Rob Kahn does some. Well, he has a similar side finish, and then what's this? Rusum, just see ever how you pronounce that, does something sort of similar. But I realized that you can actually use your hips to rotate up, and not as a finishing move, but just as a way of you put them in this position, and there's nothing they can do to stop it, and in sort of their arm, it doesn't even matter anymore whether it's in front of or not. It's just this really cool. Um, it's a really cool way of setting up the arm triangle. Now it makes it sort of like once you have the crossface and underhook, now you have the submission because the other part is unstoppable, um, more or less. But then the chest compressor thing just makes it one step easier than that because like you don't even have to transfer things over. You just finish it there. And so I think that one in particular is just it's not you don't have to go as far to get it. Like there's a there was an Instagram dork post on Reddit today where he was talking about some move, and there people were commenting like why wouldn't you just do a mounted triangle or just take the armbar or just take a back take?
Oh yeah, that Neil Melanson choke thing.
And I think the same thing. Like, yeah, I mean, if you can get there, there are better options. It's just like why would you go further for something that's not as good, right? So like that's a real hallmark of shitty Instagram techniques. But if there's something like a chest compressor that is more available, then like that's another thing that makes me think, hey, this just hasn't been tried right because no one knows how to get their hips in the right position to finish this. No one knows how strong it could be even at lower weights. And so like I want to be looking for conceptual understandings that do that. And I think that even if you're a white belt or a blue belt or whatever, if you are trying things not because they look cool and not because you want to be doing something different, but if you want it to be a straightforward application of your principles, even when they disagree with mainstream jiu-jitsu, I think you're probably going to do well. And um, and that's just a commitment to your principles and commitment to understanding. I don't think that's as out of reach. I think most people are bad at that, but I don't think
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't necessarily disagree with what you're saying right there. I just have zero faith in the majority of humanity to not get carried away with stuff.
right. I mean, well, to try what I'm talking about doing and fail, or to not try what I'm doing and instead do something else.
Yeah, I don't disagree with the last thing that you're saying there. If I was just to rewind back where you first talked about mat time versus actually like conceptual thinking and like streamlined thought process, I agree. just usually when it comes to first learning, we have to learn when we're at the gym. And depending on the resources that the person has available, obviously, with like there's YouTube, all those, there's a lot of crap, there's a lot of good. You have more websites than ever before, you have instructionals. There is the ability to start challenging yourself and growing still from home. But for a lot of people, learning jujitsu definitely starts at the mats and continues a lot at the mats, and you have to start building the conceptual understanding, which also comes through the physical experimentation. So when you're first learning how to try to do these techniques and you're inevitably going to be failing, you're going to be getting your guard pass, you're going to be getting swept, submitted, etc., and you learn from that. Now the conceptual understanding, 100% agree. It's entirely what I base my entire jujitsu around. You can get better faster with less training time. There is still the aspect of having to dedicate time to making these techniques instilled in your body and being able to physically call upon them. So just because I understand a lot about how to control my opponent's legs, deny the base, and attack a heel hook, and I've studied it, I have to still put in that mat time. And so that's where like I still factor in mat time in the sense where the time that I'm spending getting working on the proper dig and breaking mechanics to get that heel hook, to practice my entries and exits from the position, how to tie that stuff into my passing, real drilling time and implementing that while sparring is very important. And we can absolutely streamline stuff and spend less time on things. And I agree with you because I've seen it before as well, where you're watching people work on something and you're like, man, that is fundamentally flawed. It's not there. And that's because they don't have that conceptual understanding. And I see this even with world champions where guys are missing stuff. And I've trained with some high level guys where whether they're trying to explain a technique to each other, what the one person's doing differently, and it's just taken them forever to try and figure it out. Or a lot of these guys, they're not very good at teaching and conveying this information to students because they've learned through a process of elimination. Where if you take some guy who's only speaks Portuguese, has very broken English, he's not learning the conceptual understanding behind jujitsu, but he's becoming a world champion. He's becoming a world champion for a whole bunch of other reasons, but it's also because through a process of elimination, he is training with high level guys that he can just experience over and over again failure in certain areas and learn what's not working, how to adjust it. It's amazing when you watch someone like, even say, Marcelo Garcia try and teach something, and he's not very good at explaining it, but there's no denying that he understands what the hell he's doing and has arguably perfected the way that he's performing certain techniques because he's just destroying high level guys. And then you watch Paul Schreiner teach the same thing, and you go, "Ah, okay, yeah, that makes a lot more sense now that because Paul Schreiner is an amazing teacher and can break down the concepts of what's happening." So absolutely, conceptual understanding of techniques helps you progress faster. I do think though that mat time is still a huge factor in that development for people, and that's where still my argument lies. Where spending at least like however you've chunked it, but you're trying to focus like 80% of your time working on these techniques and the stuff that's proven and how to refine it and get better. And then if 20% of the time you want to challenge yourself and you want to experiment under these rules and restrictions like you're talking about, because you're talking about it in a very logical way where I'm like, yeah, okay, this guy's not going to get just like, he's not going to just try and figure out some wacky technique, get an erection from it, think it's the best thing in the world, and then try and like sell it. You want to really test this stuff. You want it to hold up to whatever robust training method, testing method that you have in place to make that work. And so that's very important. Then when we're talking about variations of techniques, I think it's important to kind of note like certain techniques, like when we look at the triangle choke, there's several ways that it's taught of how it's being how it can be successful, variations of this. But we also got to understand that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, we can over-engineer the shit out of this thing. So when we look at like the perfect steps that you have to complete to finish that triangle, like John Danaher, it's going to be over-engineered to an extent where it's a very good way of completing the triangle, but it's not absolutely necessary to always get success because we have such a mechanical advantage in this situation where we have a high concentration of force to a very small part of our opponent where we have our legs where you can fuck that triangle choke up. You can do the old school pulling the leg or the arm across, squeeze your legs from straight on. And I mean, shit, you're still going to choke people unconscious because the amount of pressure we need to occlude the arteries to cut off blood to our opponent's brain, it's not very much. And so, same like the arm triangle. I mean, there's some shitty ways of doing the arm triangle, but it's still another submission that we see at the higher level, and we see variations of how it's finished. Whether it's also transitioning to more on the side, like reverse Ezekiel's, no gi or gi versions, where yeah, chokes. Chokes, I think, are affected less by the idea of mechanical strength because we're able to just clearly cut off people's blood to their brain and we're able to knock people out in training. Obviously, the main thing is going to be what are the defenses that are people throwing at us, but we don't get to break each other's arms on a daily basis and still have training partners. People are tapping way too early to things or aren't comfortable fighting those things or have flexibility where chokes are usually are always very much more recognized as the thing that no matter what the person has for skill, the drugs that are in their system, the strength or flexibility, if you cut blood off to the brain, people go unconscious and they eventually die. And so it's a much more robust technique in the sense, whatever variation of it, that we're able to come up with variations and test stuff and know that we're still putting people unconscious.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to test a choke than
Yeah,
to test it.
100%.
Can I break your tibia? I've only got one real attempt where I thought I was going to be able to test that, but um, and then he tapped anyway, so I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah, I popped a guy's foot pretty badly. I think it might have broken some of the bones on the very top of his foot from an ankle lock. I was still happy with that because I was able to actually start getting something going and then got the tap. I tore one guy's bicep, which was a total accident. I really didn't want that to happen, but just in the heat of the moment, it did in a competition where he was unable to tap fast enough. It's like, okay, there's my breaking mechanics where I got to see something improve. And it was at that same competition I talked about where I failed 3 arm bars. And then on the fourth guy, I ripped his arm. But at the same time, this guy was an older gentleman, and so he could have been already more prone to injury, less flexible, not as up to date on his armbar defenses. So that's another thing where it's like I don't just take that and go, "Oh yeah, I'm fucking awesome at arm bars." It's like, okay, I saw measurable success to a certain person, but I still need to obviously account for the fact that I failed 3 times against these more flexible younger guys, and I need to keep refining what I'm working on, but arm bars are something that are super legit.
And no
And
one's
so
shin's flexible.
no, no, that's for sure. So it sounds like we're not completely on opposite sides of how we're approaching stuff. It's just
Mhm.
uh I guess the realism and the steps taken when we're trying to innovate and look at things and being very careful with that. Where I usually more like I'm definitely doubling down as like devil's advocate when I talk about the stuff in the videos where it's like I'm trying to just tell people like I got this one video to reach out to people and they're mostly white belts and blue belts. Stop trying these low level techniques that aren't working and trying to dabble in all this crazy stuff on Instagram. Let's look at evidence and figure out what's working, and I do not agree with the idea of just parroting that stuff and copying it and not having a conceptual understanding, which I think is more the stance that you took when we started talking about this. But that's I'm very much on the same side as you, where if we understand the principles and the concepts, the what's working biomechanically with human bodies, as well as what's happening at a physical level when we're talking about gravity and leverage and stuff like that, making sure that that stuff's in place and that we understand it because it's going to give further meaning to our technique and allow us to create variations of these techniques, whether we're looking at just a guard pass or a sweep versus actually getting as far as submissions, and then making sure that we're following all those steps, these robust testing methods, and just keeping our expectations grounded in reality when we're focusing on these different submissions and trying to innovate and push things. I think it's much less common that if you take a white belt or a blue belt, unless they have a background, say something like wrestling, where you have a different point of view of how to look at something, like say the chest compressor, that to say a white belt is going to be the person that's going to find the way of completely changing the game with a certain submission that black belts haven't already tried and tested. I think it's very improbable that something like that's going to happen. It's not impossible, but it becomes very
Well, it just takes a
improbable.
while to do. Like I
Yes.
started thinking about all this stuff at white belt, but I mean, and I didn't, and I spent a while there for other reasons. But by the time I get a lot of stuff figured out, I just not a white belt anymore. You just can't be. So
Hmm.
I think yeah, it's unlikely for a white belt to have solved all the problems. But I think you should start. I think that if I had to summarize my position, it's actually have an expectation of understanding what the hell you're doing. And if you can't understand when you're how you're wrong, keep doing it until someone can show you they're wrong. Be bold enough to believe in yourself until you can find a way to get proven wrong, and go seek it. Because sometimes
I
you'll
don't,
find it,
yeah,
sometimes you won't.
I agree with that. If students come to me with questions and question why techniques work, or they want to kind of challenge and say that something doesn't work, this was something that was really big for us. when we worked when I was moving up through the belt ranks with my instructor Rob, where my fellow counterpart and black belt Cal McDonald that I've come up with, we were always challenging Rob and being like, "Well, we like doing it like this. What's wrong with it?" And sometimes, like, it would just be a variation that does work, not reinventing the wheel. We're not doing something different that no one else has done before, but there's just multiple ways of skinning the cat with certain techniques. And Rob would always provide very clear, concise answers to why something didn't work. And that's something that I absolutely believe in. So I do not disagree with you on that sense. It's just unfortunately a lot of people do not have instructors that are capable of handling stuff so conceptually and with such well worded answers.
Yeah, gotta
Yeah.
figure it out for yourself.
Yep, absolutely. But just then there's still that, as long as there's that understanding of the limitation where it's like as we're trying to figure that stuff out ourselves, that we will sometimes be crashing into roadblocks, or a lot of the time, especially at earlier stages where we try something that's different and we it's not ultimately successful, but we do gain an understanding further of conceptually
Hmm.
why it didn't work, because yeah, you're challenging, you're trying to figure it out, you're doing adaptive problem solving. And I think that's where we're kind of both stand in agreement, where it's much better to try and figure the stuff out and fail and learn from that rather than just accepting everything as fact and regurgitating information.
Yep, I'll agree with that. Yeah,
Perfect. Well, Jade, thank you so much for actually like wanting to get together and do this, because I think it's so cool that we're starting to get like these more scientific thought processes to jujitsu, and we want to talk about this stuff because regardless of like whether we ended up agreeing on a lot of things, we're still having this discussion, and it's challenging for me to try and think of being prepared for any of these answers or questions that you're going to rise and counter stuff, whether we end up agreeing or disagreeing, thinking about it. And I think even just from like the beginning of this conversation to the end, whether our perspectives have changed at all, we have at least just been further challenged on our beliefs and had to come up with stuff. And that thought process is just going to make us better jujitsu practitioners.
sounds good.
Awesome. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I mean, obviously, this is right now at an hour and 28 minutes. I don't know if it's going to be any shorter by the time I just kind of cut out some of our audible pauses and clean it up and whatnot. But I challenge you guys to try and have these discussions with people and have this mindset like Jay has, where even at an earlier stage, learn a conceptual approach to Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and question stuff. You should always be questioning stuff. We see this everywhere where people are not just going to be following everything they hear, but it's really important that the stuff that you are choosing to follow is based on evidence or based on a conceptual understanding, fundamental principles of what makes it sound. Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this talk that Jay and I got to have. Thank you, Jay, for coming out. And yeah, challenge everything, guys. Go out there, learn, and try and become better at jujitsu.